Hello everyone. This time we're talking about applying psychological methods. And by applying I mean the application of the findings and methods utilized to uncover some of the scientific knowledge that we have out there in the field by practitioners. So applying the psychological findings in some cases, or just seeing what people do in the field in terms of their everyday jobs that maybe could be utilizing some of the findings that we try to generate as scientists. So part of this is the divide that many of us play between being scientists and being practitioners. And in psychology, we sort of have this model that sort of emphasizes that we should be doing a little bit of both, or at least be trained and knowledgeable in both. We call this the Scientist-Practitioner Model. So it's kind of related to practitioners, of course, and scientists in the way that we should embody both roles as psychologists. The practitioner, of course, for the most part, applies psychological principles. They work in industries and schools and public sectors that are trying to initiate changes, maybe improvements in learning within schools. So we say they're primarily results-driven, right? Trying to make changes. It's not about success and failure. They really want to see changes. Where scientists, failure is sometimes part of the game. Sometimes you learn just as much from failure because we're trying to understand behavior. So we conduct research in universities and sometimes research labs that are privately funded, like through the government or let's say a drug corporation. And in those situations, they're primarily, understanding behavior through research and experimentation of some sort, right? Maybe surveys too. All these sorts of methods are utilized, and then the practitioners hopefully are using these findings out there in the field, right? The Lilienfeld 2002 article is sort of related to the role that scientists play and that sort of divide that exists sometimes between scientists and non-scientists. Sometimes research does not translate easily, or its generalizability, that relationship to the real world is not clear necessarily to non-scientists or practitioners out there utilizing the findings of scientific researchers. So Lilienfeld is really about this, and it's an interesting article to take a look at. I encourage you to. There may be a question on the final about it, or exam number 3. This is really concerning the issue through the lens of a meta-analysis that was published by Rind and colleagues in 1996 that created a lot of controversy. Sort of pop psychologists and even the American Psychological Association sort of attacked these scientists who are just doing sort of a statistical meta-analysis type of study on child abuse. The problem is their findings didn't agree with what some people think of common sense. So the common sense, of course, in this case, did not agree with the research results, and the article is really about how to communicate research results and the responsibilities of researchers communicating to practitioners what this research really means for them in the field. So that's really important for consumers. Their sort of notions in the field may not agree with what we find in the lab, and that balance needs to be very clear as to how generalizable these results maybe are. In fact, they say that preconceived notions and bias should be avoided at all costs, and I think that's very true when you think of what common sense can be sort of laden with, sort of the bias and common sense that's sort of all around us that may or may not be supported by science, right? And they offer this quote by someone named Huxley, follow humbly wherever and to whatever analyses or abysses nature leads, or you will learn nothing, right? So it's basically saying go into research with an open mind and see where your results take you, and then hopefully you can explain what those results mean, right? But sometimes research is controversial. Practitioners, on the other hand, they have to rely on the proper ethics and practice of these researchers because they are applying these findings, right? And just about every field of psychology has some sort of applied side, taking this research and utilizing it in some way, whether it's more medical or therapeutic, right? So practitioners are out there and they're trained sometimes at the exact same institutions as scientists, sometimes maybe with different coursework, or maybe they don't have to do a dissertation. Instead, maybe they do more practice, like with PsyD programs, where you get a lot of experience doing therapy. But sometimes translating research into practice is difficult, and they are required to do this a lot of times to stay up to date and utilize research findings in their applied settings, whether that's organizational settings or therapeutic settings, like I said. And there's many opportunities and different applications within the field of psychology, and that's what I'm going to spend most of the time on today, going through some of these applied fields that utilize the findings of scientists. So, for example, clinical psychologists. Clinical psych is a field of psychology that really looks at, tries to study, understand individuals in terms of their psychological differences, right? So clinical psych in the field is really utilizing the psychological tests that are developed by psychologists, utilizing different types of therapy, maybe in sort of group interventions or group house situations. So they can do therapy across a range of different types of modalities. Psychotherapy is probably the most common, but there's also sorts of behavioral and applied behavioral analysis, ABA types of therapy that exist. And then, things like humanistic psychology can be a sort of philosophy for therapists. And of course, there's sort of cognitive therapy and drug therapy and all sorts of other ways of intervening in these sort of thought processes. And of course, all of these are based on the research that is being done on the proper therapies or the best types of drugs for something like anxiety disorders. Of course, I mentioned modalities, so individual therapy, family therapy. I'll mention marriage and family therapy again later. Group therapies for all sorts of disorders exist, emotional eating, drug, physical rehabilitation, and sometimes the research is really related to what types of, let's say, therapy, family versus group, works best for different types of issues, maybe eating disorders versus drug rehabilitation. For example, in some cases, you might see more reoccurrence of the issues if they're in a social setting. In other situations, social settings might help the healing process. Based on the type of illness, different types of therapies might be recommended. And without the ability to translate that research into practice, that can be a problem. So the training of psychologists, even those that go applied, is so crucial. School psych is a extension of clinical psych in some ways. At the school I went to graduate school at, the main clinical psych program was a school psych program, but had a very strong clinical focus. They're basically using clinical principles, sometimes issues even like PTSD on school children, and to see, let's say, how that affects their learning processes, but all sorts of anxiety, learning difficulties. The main thing is that it's with a student population, but usually with the goal to sort of maximize learning, lower behavioral problems or disturbances, those sorts of things. So in school psychology, a lot of it has to do with testing, right? Intelligence testing, attention deficit disorder testing. So that's a good example that attention deficit and hyperactive disorder have kind of been combined in some ways, where they used to be somewhat more separate. So that sort of reconceptualization of attention deficit and hyperactive disorder is important for people out there applying psychology in the field, making sure that they understand the sort of symptomology that they're seeing around them and treat it with the best practices. Even things like study skills can be improved by school psychologists. Interventions in, let's say, primary or secondary schools, looking at, let's say, improving that even with, let's say, college athletes. They have a great tutoring system, accountability sort of system for student athletes most of the time, where other students may not have that sort of check-in to keep them on track. And that's been shown to be effective, of course. Forensic and clinical or criminal psychology is one that's often popular. I often wonder where the jobs are, if they're more in jails, if they're more in courtrooms. I don't personally know anybody that does this, but I think it's fascinating to look at sort of the field of criminal justice, crime prevention. I think these sorts of programs could really get big over the upcoming years with the focus on, implicit bias, racial justice, things like that within different communities, academic and otherwise. They look at things like crime prevention and detection, prison reform, all sorts of stuff. So, for example, the work on lie detectors has shown that they're very unreliable, can be faked, that sort of stuff. They've shown how witness selection, and unfortunately some psychologists work within witness selection to sort of pinpoint, even down to sort of zip codes, preferences on things like the death penalty. Criminal profiling is something you see on TV a lot. I don't know how many police departments actually have a criminal profiler in there working with the chief of police. That's probably a Hollywood invented job for the most part. But one thing that's really important is prison reform. Many prisons have re-termed their whole practice from rehabilitation to punishment or incarceration, and that is an unfortunate shift. I think the research on prisoner well-being, ways to encourage rehabilitation and therapy through the prison system have been encouraging. So of course more research and practice needs to be done in that field. Community psych is another interesting field that looks at really the larger group that individuals find themselves within communities, and look to see how community planning and community interventions can really change community-wide statistical sort of results. Things like lighting in communities. I've helped install lighting through organizations into neighborhoods that maybe have higher crime, and just by installing motion sensor lighting on the sides of houses of busy streets, you lessen the amount of criminal activity. So things like neighborhood planning, like I said, school success, at the neighborhood sort of level, those sort of school ratings that you see, like if your high school is like an 8 or a 9, part of that is sort of that community level information. And then of course things like poverty and substance abuse, there's sort of social issues that you may see increase or decrease based on the sort of national economic indicators. And of course, the interventions that can take place with groups and individuals at the community level to help maybe lessen substance abuse. Related to substance abuse, health psych is something that we have a couple great psychologists in our department that work on. This is really looking at the psychological sort of balance between mind and body. Behavioral medicine is sort of another term for it, in terms of how we sometimes interpret illness, or how different sorts of illnesses create psychological sort of outlooks, if you will. So we look at individual health promotion in this area, illness prevention, sometimes at a much more broad level, such as like national health prevention, stuff like Michelle Obama's Get Out and Exercise initiative. But individual health promotion, can be done at many different levels. And one thing that really is psychological about it is that sort of back and forth or vice versa between our illnesses and our moods. There's a great book out there called Anatomy of an Illness that I recommend for people that are dealing with long-term illness or long-term hospital stays. Anatomy of an Illness is really related about the psychology of illness and sort of the healing process. Anyways, illness prevention, of course, within occupations and organizations is super important, such as with automobile industries that use automobiles or transportation a lot. There's a lot of accidents and injuries related to driving occupations or occupations that include driving. So all sorts of stress reduction, worker fatigue issues, things like that can be really important to look at. Personality and social psychology is a very big field that most students don't really know exists, so I like to bring it up. It's really the fields of personality and the fields of social psychology have really merged over the years, and it's a very interactional sort of discipline now, where it's typically looking at thoughts, feelings, behaviors, sort of based on or sometimes interacting with the environments that they find themselves in. So maybe individual dispositions mixed with sort of provoking situations, like stressful situations that maybe health psychologists might be focused on too. So things they look at are things like affect and affectivity, so mood, right, and personality in general, and what sort of personality predicts. Some of my earliest research was just really looking at how personality predicts job attitudes, for example, like how happy you are with your job. There's research that shows that we can predict your job satisfaction at age 25 based on your personality at age 5. So that's pretty fascinating when you think about it. Social psychology is really about more so the power of the environment that you find yourself in. So let's say group influences on behavior. Helping behavior, for example, decreases with the more people that are around. You have that sort of excuse not to help or whatever. So that can be very influential on you. or influence your behavior to help. But also influence and bias is a big one there, sort of power and influence, sort of mind control or freedom is one of the classes that we offer in this area, specifically looking at persuasion techniques. But most of this involves some sort of person by situation interaction, like I said. So some sort of trait mixed with some sort of powerful situation that could change the way people act in those situations. Lastly, industrial organizational psychology is something, of course, close to home for me. And what I love about IO psychology is that it's basically anything that you want to study at work, right? So it's really looking at the well-being of workers, the ways to motivate workers, but also issues related to safety, discrimination, bias within practices, and making sure that, let's say, selection tests are valid for workers. There's all sorts of stuff that we do related to selection and the validity of the tests, discrimination claims, things like that. I had a professor that would get hired out to sort of defend organizations who were being accused of discrimination, and most of the time they were discriminating, and he would not defend them. Anyways, training, of course, is a class that I teach in IR psychology and is really important for making sure that employees learn what they're supposed to, and that learning in the training environment, as I said in the last lecture, translates to the work environment. Also, org development, so stuff related to groups and teams. We have a course on that at CSULB2. Leadership and power. Some research on leadership, for example, is all about how the best type of leadership is transformative. So for those practitioners in the field, encouraging and training employees to have that transformative types of leadership would be the most contemporary and consistent with what the research is recommending, right? Some emerging fields I wanted to give a shout out to, and you'll see a special someone there on the slide. Neuropsychology is a big field dealing with sort of the mind and sometimes injuries to the brain and sort of the interaction with those different pieces of the brain and how they form our thoughts and feelings and emotions and perceptions. Environmental psychology is really looking at how our environment and our psychology interact with each other. So sort of how the environment shapes our well-being, if you will. Coaching is important, not just executive coaching, but life coaching. All sorts of coaching is really gaining in popularity right now. Of course, the licensure and credentials for that are up to debate. So you have to go to a school that focuses on coaching, or get a degree in something like organizational psychology and then specialize in something like executive coaching. Educational psychology is similar to school psychology, but is really being built up in a lot of schools now within ed programs. So you may not find them in psych programs, but they're doing similar stuff to school psych, maybe sometimes at a more macro level, some more institutional sort of metrics. Sports psychology is also always growing in popularity and looks at not just sort of the well-being, but also the motivation and maybe longevity and transitioning out of sports into the real world, if you will. I put pet psychology because I saw that on some of my searches recently. Pet and animal psychology is one of those sort of burgeoning fields that I think could be an interesting option for some people. And then finally, marriage and family therapy. And our esteemed president, Dr. Connolly there, is actually a marriage and family therapist by trade and has utilized that in many different sort of contexts in organizational sorts of ways as a leader institutionally at our school and others. And as she describes it, marriage and family therapy really teaches you about the systems at play and how systems can create dynamics. And that's what marriage and family therapy is really all about. So that applied into the field can really turn into some amazing occupations. It's amazing options for y'all. Anyways, I hope this gives you an idea of some of the fields out there and sort of the importance of how research can really affect and determine the success of the job that they do out there. Anyways, hope you enjoyed this and see you next time.